Hello and welcome to the Digital PR Podcast. I'm Steve Baker and my co-host Lou is off doing the rather more important job of raising a tiny human. But the show must go on. We're in between seasons at the moment, but thought we'd give you all a little treat by bringing back our mini episodes throughout June and July. We'll be jumping into all of PR Land's hottest topics, as we always do, and hearing from members of the Propellernet PR team on everything from pitching to personality types. So get the kettle on, get those headphones charged, and make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of our episodes.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital PR Podcast. For this episode, we've got something a little bit different. So we've got myself, Richard Poole, I'm the Creative Director at Propellernet, and Abby Bennetts, PR Director at Propellernet. And we're going to be talking about a subject that's close to both of our hearts, really, around mental health, anxiety in digital PR, and wrapping all of that together, like PR personalities, because there's a lot of those in the PR industry. But I thought a good place to start, really, because Abby, yourself, you've actually done some research around the subject. And it's actually something we together, I know you've done talks on the subject and things like that, but we've actually not spoken about that together. So it felt like a perfect way to kick this off. Yeah, no, and you've done studies on this. Wanted to ask, like, one, why you wanted to do it, and two, yeah, really interested in what you found out about these PR personalities and how that ties back to the subjects of mental health, anxiety, burnout, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Really excited to be talking about this topic today. As you say, yeah, it's kind of a topic that's kind of close to my heart and something that I think we maybe don't talk enough about in the industry. So the sort of study that I did was for a talk at an agency event last year and kind of stemmed from my experience of going through burnout. So about 3 years ago, I was signed off by doctors and sort of left a digital PR agency role that I really loved because I was just completely burnt out, and my mental health was not in a great place. I realized I hadn't really been looking after myself properly. And as a result, my mental health was just really, really suffering. So I took some time out and then managed to get a role at Propellernet. And ever since then, I suppose I've just been more sensitive to noticing that so many people in our industry do go through sort of challenges with their mental health. A lot of people in our industry suffer with burnout. And so it really just got me thinking that I'd like to explore that a bit more, the sort of reasons behind why we might be at risk of suffering burnout more than perhaps people who work in other industries. And so, yeah, I wanted to do a bit of an experiment, bit of a study to find out sort of why that was. And sort of looking into it a bit further, I did find that this is kind of like an industry-wide problem. So there is a report that's done every single year, which is called the Global Agency Landscape Report. And it says that over 55% of agencies reported that preventing burnout is their top challenge every year. So kind of just goes to show that like agencies around the nation are really trying to stop their employees from sort of having these challenges with mental health and getting burnt out. But at the same time, there's still all these people who are really sort of struggling to get that work-life balance. They're really sort of struggling to maintain a good mental health while working in the industry. So I think there's like a few reasons for this. I think firstly, like our roles, particularly as digital PRs, it's quite like an always on role. So we kind of have to be tied into the news. We have to be, always thinking about ideas for campaigns. And that does mean that it's quite hard to switch off, particularly if you're passionate about your job, which I think is something we've spoken about before, Richard, about being sort of loving your job and loving the creative side so much that you're always kind of thinking of ideas. You're always kind of thinking of new things that you could bring to your role and to your campaigns and for your clients. But actually that does mean that you're then left feeling like quite exhausted, and then your sort of mental health suffers as a result. So I think that plays into it quite a lot. I think working in agencies, you often get higher workloads. Agencies are really quick moving. It's a competitive industry. And particularly at the moment, it's getting harder and harder for sort of people to get those links and get that coverage. So I think people feel like they almost have to work more. So there's kind of all these reasons that play into why we might be suffering more with burnout and sort of mental health challenges as an industry. But one thing that I kind of anecdotally sort of noticed just by chatting to, sort of friends in the industry, colleagues, was that there are a lot of similar people working in digital PR. And I don't know whether you've noticed this as well from sort of past roles, even our own team at Propellernet. we're all really similar.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It's like you start talking to somebody like, you're just like me. Like, what is it? Like, yeah, I think yeah, like you say, so many similar personalities in the industry. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it did make me think like maybe there was this sort of personality trait that we all share, which, maybe that makes us really good at our jobs and why we love doing what we do. But it's also at the same time this kind of trait which does leave us at risk of suffering with sort of mental health issues, and perhaps more sort of prone to suffering with burnout as well. So I wanted to look into that. I have a background in sort of psychology, did psychology at uni, so kind of stemmed from my interest in that as well. So basically, I did a very, very mini study where I surveyed over 100 digital marketers. Over half of those were digital PRs, the others in other digital marketing roles, sort of spanning SEO, paid, stuff like that, and tested them on this big 5 personality trait, which is called conscientiousness. And this is essentially the personality trait which reflects the tendency to be organized, goal-directed, and hardworking. So basically this real sort of keen bean trait of wanting to do well, really like striving for big goals and going after what we want, which again, with a lot of the people that I've worked with in my career in digital PR, I find that to be true. So really felt like that sort of resonated. But people who have high levels of conscientiousness also suffer really badly with high levels of perfectionism, so much so that this can sort of bring out counterproductive behaviors. Obviously, like lots of high levels of anxiety comes with being a perfectionist. So it does mean that we're more prone to burnout and people pleasing. So I did this personality test, and lo and behold, it did show that these digital marketers all showed above average scores in this conscientiousness trait. Almost 1 in 10 scored. So you have this test and it scores out of 40. Over 1 in 10 scored 35 out of 40 on conscientious traits. So really, really showing up highly in this sort of personality trait of being like really hardworking and sort of goal directed. And on top of that, 67% considered themselves a perfectionist. So was just kind of like a confirmation of what I had been thinking, that we all kind of share these traits, and that's great. But the sort of flip side of that is that we are sort of potentially more at risk of suffering from these perhaps less helpful behaviors of sort of being a perfectionist, being quite high in anxiety, and stuff like that. That was the
So
study.
interesting. And yeah, resonates massively with me. Like I've always found myself to be a massive perfectionist, and I agree. I think being in the industry of keen beans. So yeah, it's super interesting study. But like you say, there is that side to it where it may be something we all have to navigate a little bit within ourselves. But then there is that obviously the positive element to it. Like it's great to be a hard worker. It's really good to be a keen bean and to want your work to be as good as possible. So like how can these traits of ourselves, of a lot of us in this industry, how can they be useful to us, and how can people kind of positively leaning into these?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I completely agree. I do think this sort of trait that a lot of us do share is kind of like our superpower, which sounds really cringe, but it is one of the things that kind of makes us great at our jobs. And it's the reason why a lot of great digital PRs sort of get the amazing results they do. I think particularly in our industry and with our work, a lot of it is sort of self-directed. So there's no sort of end point to how much you can do on a particular idea or a campaign. Like there's always more pitching to do, or there's always more cool ideas to come up with. And so I think when you have that sort of self-motivating trait of just wanting to do as best as you can and do as much as you can, that's obviously amazing and such an asset for anyone who's part of a digital PR team. So I think that's like a really positive trait to have. I think in order to manage that effectively, there are a few things that I would probably, or I do implement in my career now, which I think we're going to talk about a little later on in the podcast. But I think, yeah, really leaning into those sort of traits of being like super organized and, being able to juggle lots of clients or lots of stories. That's a really, really good skill to have. So it's definitely not a bad thing to have this trait. I think it's just being aware of when that amazing trait then sort of is not working for you in the way that it is sort of productive or good anymore.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Like, yeah, I'd agree as well. I've had times where I've done myself down for being like, you're too much of a perfectionist or whatever, but it's like, That's actually a good thing, and there's areas of
Yeah.
that to look into. It is just that, yeah, like you say, knowing when to be like, okay, I need to switch off now. So, yeah,
Yeah.
great advice. Also within that, obviously, like we say, we all tend to share a lot of similar personality traits in the industry, but then even at Propellernet in the PR team, we do also talk a lot about how all of us are different in
Mm.
ways. Yeah, it's great to have different people
Mhm.
in a client team, and we can all bounce off of that as well. So
Mm.
yeah, knowing that there are kind of these differing, clashing ones, as well as us all sharing some of these traits, like how would you recommend like balancing them in a team and making sure people do play to their own advantages if they are different in some ways too?
Yeah, it's so important that any team, not just the digital PR team, but any team is a mix of different backgrounds, different ages, different experiences, and different personality traits. And we definitely have it, as you say, on the Propellernet team, which is so nice because I think you just get so many different perspectives and so many different lovely relationships with people that you might not necessarily always be like drawn to from the off. Like personalities don't always sort of attract each other from the off. But I think it's so nice when you're able to get a team that works so well together, which is such a nice mix of different personalities. So I think it's really nice and important to sort of try and get a mix of different sort of personalities when it comes to sort of introversion and extroversion. So really making sure that you've got those people who are sort of happy to speak up and are quite confident and maybe sort of more socially driven. But then you also do have those people who are a little bit quieter and sort of happy to sit back and observe and sort of take things in. And I think there is this whole discussion about whether, PRs should be extroverts. A lot of PRs naturally are, just because, well, I'm not even really sure. I suppose because it's quite a social job. You're obviously talking a lot with journalists. A real, obviously, key strength of being a good digital PR is about communication. But I do think there's obviously so many amazing digital PRs and amazing people generally who are more introverted or a mix of the two. I think more and more people are sort of saying that they are a mix of both, being extroverted in certain situations and introverted at the same time. So yeah, I think getting that mix is really important so that you can really get those different perspectives, and just have a range of voices in your team. I think as well, something that's quite nice to think about is like the sort of different types of emotional people on your team. So whether you have people who are more logical and are sort of thinking about the facts and the data and just what's happening in real time. And then you have some people who are more emotional and sort of go with their feelings, go with their gut. And I think, again, having both of those working together on a project is really, really cool and just enables you to get different perspectives and just have a nice mix. So, yeah, I think it's definitely important to have that mix of personalities and just getting people to name their own sort of strengths and what they think are their sort of personality traits that they want to really lean on so that they can sort of express those in their day-to-day roles.
Yeah, I think you're so right. Like that thing of the mix is so important, isn't it? Like, and you mentioned in there, like some people may be feeling they should be a certain way. Like I 100% had that earlier on in my career, looking at other people who I was working with, being like, I'd class myself as an introvert, and I'd looking at the extroverts, being like, I should be more outgoing. But it's people, I think managers in a team and people within the team realizing that no, it's like I bring this to this team, and I think that is perfect. I'd definitely rather not people all be the same. Like it's so good having that kind of mix of personality, mix of strengths and weaknesses in a team. Like it's so essential, isn't it? It's a great shout. Alongside that, and like within your study, you mentioned it. You mentioned it right at the start, actually. Kind of a topic we both wanted to touch on was burnout in
Mm-hmm.
PR and digital PR,
Mm-hmm.
marketing in general. It's something you see spoken about a lot. Like you've suffered from it, Abby. Like it was a kind of, you say, like the catalyst for you doing the study. I've had
Mm-hmm.
it. Like we are definitely prone to burnout in the industry. And what are the factors really that you think play into digital PRs getting burnout and the things that could maybe tip us over?
I think there's a lot of different factors that play into it, to be honest. I think one of the big ones, which I've kind of already touched upon a little bit, is this whole idea of like there's always more to do, or at least that was kind of the thing that I felt really strongly when I was first starting out in my digital PR career. I didn't really have any sort of boundaries personally around like, no, I've done enough for today. Like I've done that pitching. I could do more pitching, but I don't have to do more pitching. So that kind of self-directed workload, I think, is kind of hard to manage if you've not been in a job or a role where someone sort of managed that for you, I suppose. Because I started my career out in a digital PR agency and then have just sort of worked my way up in a couple of different agencies. But I think without that sort of experience of really learning, like, no, enough's enough, I'm logging off, I'm sort of having those boundaries, I found that really, really hard to grapple with. And I was kind of striving for these results from my clients. I was wanting to progress personally, like felt like I was like quite ambitious at the time and really wanting to push things at work. But that meant that I didn't really have that sort of mindset basically of being able to switch off, because I always felt like there was more to do. So I think that's definitely a thing that I now keep in mind, particularly when sort of working with like junior members of the team who might not have had sort of much experience of working in sort of an agency culture, and just really trying to share my experience and sort of really reiterate that like, no, enough's enough. When it hits 5:30 or whatever, it's time to log off, because that was something I struggled with personally. I think generally high workloads, particularly if you work in an agency, everyone knows agency life is crazy and that's what we love about it. But it also does mean that sometimes, particularly in busy periods, it is high workloads and there's a lot to juggle and there's lots of different tasks as well. So it's not like you're just doing one thing, the same thing every single day. It's a lot of different like account management and ideas and pitching and writing. And I think that does actually take quite a toll on your brain. Like I really do get to the end of some weeks, like a busy week, and I just can't even like speak or think. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I'm like, oh, if I actually looked back at all the things I'd done that week, it's not that surprising that like, yeah, your brain just gets exhausted. So I think you do have to factor that in and make sure you have these sort of protective routines and sort of boundaries around your work-life balance and stuff like that, so that you don't burn out and so that your brain is sort of protected from not getting worn down by sort of the day-to-day. So yeah, I think that's like a key one really for a lot of people who are working in agencies particular. And then there is this sort of concept, I think, a little bit, which I don't really know how you solve necessarily, but, and you might not agree with this, but I do think there's something around the sort of agency culture of like, you get so tied into the, or I did at least, you get so tied into the emotional element of like being in this agency that you love, you really like and respect the people that you get on with. You want to do well for yourself, but you also want to do well for the agency and your colleagues and stuff like that. So I think for me, there was like this huge element of guilt of like not doing enough and wanting to people please. So I think like that element of it was like a real key thing of like not feeling like I could log off, when actually it's kind of that concept of like no one's thinking about what press release you're writing. They're just thinking about getting through their own to-do list. So like, again, for me, sort of getting to grips with that was quite like a key thing, and being like, no, it's all fine. You can log off. You're cool.
Yeah, I so agree with that. Yeah, definitely don't disagree on that last one at all. I think it is like one of the things for me that I found burnout. I've seen burnout, and is a worry of mine, I guess, in the industry, is the kind of comparison culture of it in a sense of I find it. I still have it now. Is like you say, you're working on something. I'm worrying about what other people are thinking of me. I'm comparing to the rest of the team. I think especially like you say in an agency. I think agencies and in-house, like every company really, but yeah, a good agency is filled with people who are great at their jobs at the end of the day. So I think it's kind of natural, especially like you speak about the personality traits earlier of wanting to please and wanting to do great and your work to be perfect, to be like, oh, this person over here is smashing it, so like I've got to work harder. And it's that
Yeah,
thing
that's so true.
I've really kind of beaten yourself down a little bit if you're not. So it is, I agree with that kind of self-determined workload as well, and that kind of real need to call it a day, and know to call it a day is, it's just so important. I mean, you covered a few of those there actually, but I just wondered if you had any other like nuggets of advice for people that are struggling or have struggled. And obviously, like you say, it can be in peaks and troughs. So there might be a time in the future they get really busy again and would struggle with like burnout and these behaviors of comparison and things like that, like any other advice for people to kind of deal with that a little bit better in the future?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's something I now take quite seriously. And if I feel like it's slipping, I do have to have a stern word with myself to be like, no, we've got to put these things in place because otherwise things are going to get out of hand again. So I'd say one of the biggest things for me is setting like a rough working times. Like for a lot of people since COVID, they've been able to work flexibly, which I think is amazing and so great, and I love it. But I think also having a rough idea of like, okay, I'm going to start at 9. So that means, 5:30 or 5:45 latest, I am like logging off and I am doing something else. I think it's a good way to set boundaries, because if you don't have that sort of boundary in place, you could just work till 7 because there's probably stuff that you're going to want or need to do. So I think just having an idea of that time, even if you're saying to your friends or your partner, like, I'm logging off at 5:30 today, I think is really useful in just getting those boundaries in place for yourself. An easy way to do this is I schedule my exercise classes quite often for after work. So I have to leave the house at 5:30 to get to this exercise class. Otherwise, they charge me £15 if I don't turn up. So that's quite a nice motivator to get everything done on time. And not regardless, obviously there are the rare occasions where you have to work late and you have to get something done, but 9.5 times out of 10, you can log off and nothing's that important and you go off to your exercise class. So like, yeah, I think scheduling something in so you then have to sort of shut down and log off, I think is really sort of useful. And then working on your communication around sort of workloads and being able to say no, which is obviously a huge one if you do relate to being a people pleaser. And I will say, like, no one's going to hate you for saying no to not writing a press release or saying, I don't actually have time this week. Like, that's really going to stretch me. That is like a normal thing that happens day to day. And I know for some people that's like a huge struggle, and it still is something that I struggle with sometimes as well. But I think it's so key in being able to manage your workload and just feel more comfortable in your sort of day-to-day work life. So I think that's like a massive one, particularly if you're just starting out in the industry or in a role. I think it's a really important skill to have. And then the final thing I would say is to just look for a company which has a good working culture. I think the place that you work and the culture around that sort of communication of mental health and being able to feel like you can take time out or work flexibly or whatever it is when you're going through a period of low mental health is so, so important. And I would really say to look to those senior people as well within your organization to see if they're setting that good example of like, they're not working till 3 o'clock in the morning. They are sort of taking that time to look after themselves and look after their own mental health. So I think, nowhere's perfect, but I think looking for a company that has those really good sort of structures in place is so important and will make all the difference. And I do think we're quite lucky at Propellernet that we do have that. So I do feel very supported in my own mental health at this point in my career, which is really nice.
That's great to hear. Like, great you're at that place as well, because I've definitely had that. It's a journey, isn't it? Especially,
Yeah.
I think it can help sometimes when you have maybe worked at a company is not so good, because then you really know you're like, okay, things are better. But yeah, it's a journey to get to the point where you've kind of learned a lot about the things that work and don't work for you, mainly how to manage that. But yeah, it is great to get to a good place with it.
100%. So you mentioned there, obviously, you've struggled also with sort of stress-related mental health sort of challenges in the past. Was wondering if you'd be happy to tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short because there's quite a lot, to be honest. And over like, I guess working in the industry or just general life over the 35 years I've been on the planet, there's been a lot of them. But yeah, I guess I mentioned one right there is first and foremost working at places that are not good for your mental health. Like I've had experiences with those, especially one in particular, which I'd say was a particularly low point of my career. Working at a place where yeah, it's just really not good for my mental well-being. Like it is, you know it when you're in it. You're like, it is really having that effect. I was like crying in the shower before work and stuff like that. It was a horrendous thing to go through, and I actually ended up I got signed off, and then I quit the job. I was just like, I cannot do this anymore. So that was definitely a big point career wise. I would also like agree, we've spoke about it already, but like burnout, the overload with work, unrealistic demands, like everything surrounding that obviously just plays into those stress related like challenges that you have. But then I guess there's some things with myself generally that have played a part in my career that I've got to, I guess, a better point with, where it's like there's a few of them. So I've since I was born had eczema, skin related issues. Those things can have made me anyway very anxious around being around people at
Mm.
time. I mean, it's not like marketing as a role where you're around a lot of people, especially in an agency, meeting clients and stuff like that. And obviously, when you have like a skin flare, it's like you don't. Anyway, like you don't want to be. You want to shut yourself off from the world. You don't want to be present, and you don't want to be around people. So that can really play into that stress and like make work harder. So I've had a lot of that. And then again, probably working in marketing wasn't the best choice for somebody where I've got social anxiety. I mentioned earlier, I'm an introvert. So again, in a role where you're giving presentations, you're meeting people, you need to make small talk and stuff like that. And I'm like an anxious, but and was a very anxious young person. That then obviously it just added a lot of stress to my day to day, because these things would spike that stress and anxiety massively within my calendar. It was like, I've got this big face-to-face meeting commitment. It would just set the jitters in me. It would be really anxiety inducing. So a lot of that, but obviously we're going to go on to talk about it. Is like I say, I think it's a journey to overcoming some of those things, and like you've said, like being able to deal with them too.
100%. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's very relatable that a lot of people will obviously go through these challenges of anxiety or depression or whatever it sort of is, and then have to show up and be like their best selves in
Yeah.
front of clients and colleagues, and like it's so stressful. So yeah, finding a way to sort of navigate through that is, I think, really challenging. But at the other end, I suppose it's kind of like it is possible. And you will have those days where you feel super anxious and you just don't want to talk to anyone, but it is workable, and you can work in this sort of like career or role while also sort of going through stuff like that. So you kind of touched upon it before, but do you think you relate to sort of those traits of conscientiousness? Do you think that has had an influence perhaps on like anxiety levels and sort of the way you think about work and how you show up at work?
Massively. And I think like we said earlier, for better and for worse, like yeah, I guess I've got to that place where I see it as like there's been major positives to this. There's certain things of it I need to deal with. But yeah, like I mentioned, I'd massively, the perfectionist side of things massively resonates to me. I mean, like I say about skin issues and like I think just my anxiety is generally when it comes to work is wanting things to be perfect. Do you know what I mean? It's that thing a bit like, oh, but I've got this flare up, and other people throughout my life be like, I wouldn't even notice. But for me, it's like the biggest thing in the world. And it is that perfectionism. You go to a meeting, you stumble over one word, and then it's the worst thing ever. It's just that massive side of it. And I think within that, I think it probably would, we spoke about it in a team before, resonate with a lot of people in the industry, maybe, I think it plays into the perfectionism side of it, of just being a massive overthinker as
Yeah.
well. Like
Yeah.
just such a big part of it, isn't it? And I've managed to find ways to tackle that, because it's something that I've had trouble with, like I say, when it's coming up to or after any, I mean, like after this, I'll be overthinking what I've said. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sleeping tonight. I'm
yeah,
thinking about everything I've said in
yeah.
this podcast.
That's it. Worrying about it, like you have a meeting and all of those things, and like that I think just plays into it. But it does come down to just like we said, it's part of it is a good thing. Like it shows that you care, and it means something to you. And it again is just being able to manage that. But yeah, I agree. Like going back to those personality types, like yeah, they resonate with me massively.
And what would you say are the sort of top ways that you try and manage that now in sort of your day to day?
One, I think first and foremost, and this is kind of coming from me having a bit of therapy around it, but it's just recognizing that you're doing that and that you're thinking in a way and kind of being okay with that. Because before, I think like I was probably in a place where, especially with the other thing, I would just overthink, but I wouldn't see that I was over. It would just be how my mind worked on a day to day. I think when you get to a place where you recognize that behavior, like I say, like after this, I'll be overthinking it, but I'll realize that's what I'm doing and be like, mate, you need to calm down. Like you've done this with other stuff in the past, and it's been totally fine. And I think that's it. Like I say, stumbling over something in a meeting
Mm.
5, 10 years ago, it would eat me up inside. But now I'm just like, that's totally fine. And I'm at a place where, and I guess that is it. If I had my advice, it is just being able to realize, I guess, that those thoughts are maybe at times a bit silly and unwarranted, because it's like, who
Mm.
else cares about you stumbling over a single word in a presentation? Like nobody does. And I think
Mm.
it's just realizing some of these thought patterns, and maybe they are you're at times making a kind of mountain out of a molehill, really, and you don't really need to be doing that. And just I don't know, having a kind of joke with yourself, it's kind of mindfulness stuff of just realizing that you're doing things and putting that in a place and being like, you know what, I'm gonna move on from it. I've acted like this before. It's not hurt me, like stumbling
Yeah.
over it or anything like that. And I think, I guess, on the perfectionism, like a lot of the points you made earlier, I would give the same advice to, if you find yourself working too late because you feel you need to prove yourself or everything needs to be perfect, you need to find that cut-off point and to be
Mm.
like, you know what, this is good. Like I could spend hours getting into excruciating detail to make this slide the best it can be or something, but it's just not needed. Like you do need to be able to move on and call it at some point.
Totally agree with all of that. And yeah, I think the recognizing the thoughts is so important. And as you say, when you're in that sort of headspace of feeling really anxious or feeling down or whatever it is, you can't see the wood for the trees sometimes. It's so hard to step out of yourself and be like, no, this is actually just anxiety, and sort of almost labeling what it is can help so much sometimes. So yeah, I totally agree with that. When it comes to sort of work now, like it sounds like you've got sort of tips and tricks and techniques to sort of manage your mental health perhaps a bit more effectively. What would you say? Do you have any sort of red flags that pop up that you're like, okay, mental health could be in jeopardy here, like it might be on the downward spiral? What are those sort of red flags that kind of pop up for you?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, like I guess, yeah, for me, plays into things I've personally had trouble with. Like one, I would say, well, like a busyness in general, but I'd put it as like taking too much on, either
Mm.
socially or work wise. Like you mentioned earlier, I think like the power of saying no is
Hmm.
such a big thing to be able to learn, because previously, like, again, going back to being a people pleaser and all of this sort of stuff and wanting to be the best person, or maybe looking to others and being like, I need to be like that, would
Mm.
lead me to be saying yes to every single
Mm.
thing possible, like social things of work or
Mm.
outside of work. Even it's something I've had to learn to get better at, is that you say yes to all of these things, but for me and my personality type, it just burns me out so much, and
Yeah.
it's just not good. So yeah, being able to say no on that, and that is a red flag for me. I think, yeah, if I'm like, basically, I look at my calendar, I'm like, if there's too many things in a week, I need to drop some of them or say no to some of them. Like, yeah,
Honestly, I relate to that so much. I think like if I look at my calendar and I'm like, I've got a plan every single night this week, I'm like, am I feeling okay? Like, I don't think this is a good thing. But yeah, I think it's almost like a distraction thing, or for me at least, it's almost like you want to distract yourself from those like uncomfortable feelings. So I'm like, yeah, I'll just, see my favorite people and do fun stuff, when actually like I'm so anxious and I'm so sort of like not good within myself that like it's not even fun anyway. So yeah, I think that's so true.
yeah,
And yeah, important to be able to be like, no, maybe I should just have like a quiet couple of weeks, lay low, and then I'll be back to normal or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. I'm at a place now where it's like, I know I'm anxious. I know these things make me anxious. So whereas some people, great and good for them, they can do all these things in the week. I know that's not me. I know it will stress me out. So I'm
Mm.
better to say no to some of these things. And it's you said it earlier, the exact same with work. While it would be great to be like, yes, I'll get involved in this thing. That sounds amazing. I'll do it. Especially like extracurricular stuff at work sometimes can be, there's loads of opportunities. But
Hmm.
being able to be like, you know what, like I'm doing this other thing. I
Hmm.
need to, is massive in it. And like, I guess a red flag of where you could, if you took on all of these things, then
Mm.
you can burn it out. So the best thing, yeah, to say no. Other things for me as well, I guess just in my day-to-day currently that are red flags of where I could like see myself getting stressed is again too many calls, too many Slack messages, things like that, and just trying to manage that. I think it does go back to the saying no of I with Slack. I mean, just turn it off,
Hmm.
get rid
Yeah.
of the thing for a little while. Um, and then too many calls, it is being confident enough, I guess, to say like, am I needed on this call?
Mm.
Do we need
Mm.
to have this call now? And just questioning it a little bit if you're again looking at your calendar and being like, I really identify with like the memes that are like, you've got a call in, and then the hour or two before the call, you were thinking about the call. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
that resonates to me so much. So it's like, if I look at my day, and especially when it's like, I guess there's calls that are easy and fine, like, and
Mm.
they're nice, but then there are calls or meetings that would spike the anxiety a bit. So it's
Mm.
like if you've got loads in, it's yeah, I guess being confident enough to try and manage that really. Yeah, I'd say they're the red flags I see. There's obviously loads, I'd say, that sit outside of just being general red flags in a company, but in my day to day and how I guess manage my own stresses, that they would be like key ones for me. Really.
Yeah, I think so interesting and like definitely relatable. And it's kind of on the individual, I suppose, to learn what those red flags are and really be able to sort of recognize that, you know, a certain behavior or feeling is actually gonna forebode a turn for the worse. But yeah, I think it's very cool that you feel able to communicate now when those red flags come up, that you can take action so that that's not going to affect your mental health sort of later down the line. So that we kind of touched on it briefly, and it's potentially a bit of a controversial one about the sort of topic around working in environments where you're not feeling supported with your mental health. And they do exist. Everyone's sort of worked in an agency where they haven't particularly felt maybe supported, or they've felt overloaded with work and sort of had struggles with their mental health. What advice would you give to someone if they are currently working in that sort of environment where they don't feel supported with their mental health?
Yeah, I would say like number one is like try and identify if there is someone in that workplace that you can talk to about it. Because I
Mm.
think like it's so important to not bottle it up and just carry on. And I think that then would be one of the biggest red flags of a company if you're working somewhere and you don't feel that there's anybody you could talk to there. Like that is such a red flag for me, being like, okay, this is really not a good company if I don't feel comfortable talking to anyone about these challenges that I'm having. So first and foremost, I'd try and identify somebody that you could talk to. Beyond that, I mean, you've identified potentially an issue within the company you're working in, and that it's not fostering like great mental health. So obviously, I think this comes down to like whether you feel up to it with the challenges that you're dealing with. But if
Mm.
you are, you could be that catalyst for change. Like you could be the person to speak up and say, these things, there's certain things in the way we're working that just aren't good. And you can
Mm.
be the person that helps make that change. So that would be amazing if you are in a company. I know it's not possible in every single one where it could be a terrible place to work and you really don't feel that could happen. But if there's an opportunity for that and you feel like you could be the voice for that, and you know that other people are probably feeling the same, then
Mm.
amazing. And I guess my third and final piece of like advice on this would be to get out of it. Like, and it's maybe not the best advice, but like I say, I've had it myself, and it was a scary time, because
Mm.
I quit a job. I needed to cover my rent. It could have meant
Mm.
had to just move out of Brighton and move back home with my parents. Like, it was
Mhm.
not a great time, but it was like I needed to do that for myself. Felt like I could get another job, and luckily I did. And it like it's so cheesy. I believe everything happens for a reason, and it worked out. Like, and I do think making that leap, if something is really not good for you,
Yeah.
and there's no one you can talk to, there's no ways you can make it better in that company. Get out of it. Like there's so many more important things than your work. And I totally understand, like it was for me. I needed the money. I needed it. But you're way better off than getting into such a dark place where things get even worse. Like I would say, if there's no, you can't redeem it anyway. There's better companies out there. Leave, and you'll get something better.
100%. Yeah, such useful advice that, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will find valuable. I completely agree. I do think, like, yeah, you need the money, and sometimes when you're so wrapped up in that work, I think your whole sort of identity and personality can become like what you are and who you are at work. So like leaving that, particularly when you don't have anything lined up, which was very similar sort of experience that I had, is so terrifying. But there will always be something new and something that's better placed for you or better suited for you. So yeah, I think that's really, really great advice. So just thinking about living with mental health struggles sometimes, and there's these things within work can be really stressful and anxiety inducing, but are actually really important for our growth and, yeah, just great experiences that might feel like they're spiking your anxiety or your stress or sort of a risk to your mental health, but are a great experience. Do you have any examples of these that you've been through in your career to date?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess one for me, like thinking about social anxiety and things like that, is public speaking. Like it was a big side of
Mm,
it. And I think work life in general, like a lot of jobs have it, where it was one that I really early days was not into, wanted to avoid and everything like that, but was something at the same time I was like, I'd love it if I could feel comfortable doing that. So
mm,
that was a situation for me where I did end up like, yeah, I put myself out there, did my first public speaking thing. And I would say, like, my advice here for anyone who feels the same is to do it in a way that's comfortable for you. Like, I chose something where I don't know why, so I guess a weird element of me is that I feel more anxious if there's people I know in the audience. So I chose it was a speaking opportunity where it was like no one I knew would be there. So it was just completely me. So if it all went wrong, it would
mhm,
just be me and these it was like an audience of about 100 people, so it was a decent sized audience. But took that on, and so happy I did. Like I would say that to anyone. Like I really at first was so. I remember I think my first job out of uni, I got asked just to do a talk in front of like 5 people, and I was like outright refused. I could not do it. Get to the point, yeah, where I wanted to speak in front of 100 people. It's a journey there, but I would say to put yourself out there and go for it because the benefits I then got from it, it went, wow, it was good. Got loads of
mm,
good feedback and I've done it since and have continued to progress on that to a point where I'm at a good place where I'd happily do it. I'd still get anxious about it, but
mhm.
it's a side of my role in my life that I feel good about now. So I definitely think, while there's these anxieties and work and stresses that need to be managed, I do think at times like putting yourself out there and doing something that is outside of your comfort zone can pay massive dividends. And I really saw that with doing that first speaking role. I could have never done one again, but at least I did it. At least I tried,
Mm,
and
mhm.
I would recommend that to people.
Lovely. Well, I think we've come to the end of the podcast. It's been such a great discussion, covered so much around the topic of mental health in the digital PR industry. Before we sign off, I wanted to ask you what your top number one tip would be for managing stress in the digital PR world.
I've got to say, yeah, this has been gone on for ages, haven't it? Been a great chat. I jotted down loads because I knew we were going to chat about this. So I'm just gonna quickly look and pick out one. I mean, like I'd mentioned things like speaking to someone. I definitely would like really recommend that. I guess one thing I would say is, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, Abby, is to get a distraction, like when it comes to work as well. Like, because I do think like other people might disagree with this, but I think in life, like work is great, it's hugely important, but it should not be the number one thing in
Mhm,
your life. And I think one thing that can just really help take the edge off of stress and this feeling of needing to always prove yourself, you're comparing yourself to others and work really late, is yeah, having some sort of distraction. So whether that's a little side hustle, learning something, like taking up a new hobby. For me,
mhm,
and I didn't get the little guy because of this, but was having a dog. Like it's the second I got a pet, we was talking about like cut-off points. Is like I need to walk him, so it's like I'm going now. I need to, so I'm not like tied to my desk. And I
Mm-hmm.
just think having an extra element of your life, whatever that is outside of work, that you can think about, that you can shut your laptop and go on to think about that, I just think can make
Mm.
things so much easier and really take a lot of the weight off without you. Like I say, I didn't get a dog for that reason, but it's just taken a lot of the weight off just because there's another thing in my life that I care about and I've got to put my mind to, so everything isn't just solely centered on work. And I think that just massively helps manage stress. But interested, what I think we've given a lot of you've given loads of great advice. Like, what would your number one tip be?
I think that's great advice, by the way. I think one takeaway people should take from this is if you want to have good mental health, get a dog. That will solve all of your problems. I think my number one tip is something that Kirsty Hulse said. I can't remember. I think it was in a talk. This was years ago now. And she said, the times where you feel like most that you can't take a break are the times where you should take a break most. So what that means is when you're having a super, super busy, stressful day, back-to-back calls, lots of work to do, and you're thinking, I just can't take a lunch break, I'm just going to work through my lunch break. Those are the times where you need the break the most. And it feels so counterintuitive for me to go out on my little lunchtime walk, get a nice coffee, saunter around for 45 minutes when I've got like the most wild to-do list waiting for me back at home. But every single time I've done that, my stress, anxiety, mental health has been so much better for it. And I'm also way more productive after having done that as well, because I often find on those days that is when I'm most likely to spiral and feel, really sort of bad and get really anxious. And that's when, your work suffers for it as well. So yeah, I always try and keep that tip in mind and would recommend that for anyone experiencing a stressful day.
Yeah, absolutely love that. I could not agree more. I think with lunch breaks or even ending at the end of the day, sometimes there's like guilt attached to that, isn't there? Like you feel I shouldn't be taking, but it helps you, and I think it helps others out. Like if you're really frazzled, you're not
Yeah,
doing great work anyway. So
yeah, exactly.
so important. Yeah, could not agree more with that. And yeah, so that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the Digital PR Podcast.